Hello everybody. Today I want to provide a little background before my first lecture. My first lecture begins really around the 1850s, and I feel I need to position that relative to the preceding history. But believe me, these are about the broadest of brushes that one could do. Indeed, I'm a little concerned that they're a little too broad. But when I think of literacy, I'm focusing primarily on print, although I would be including visual literacy, and in reality I also would include oral literacy. But when I think of a print, one has to sort of think about, well, what was the earliest forms of it? And I was reminded, as I was thinking about talking about this lecture, about a colleague at Princeton, I believe, Dinesh Chimad Bezarat, who wrote a couple of really interesting articles based upon her anthropological work, one that appeared in Scientific American, and where she had been involved in looking through the materials from old digs from the Middle East, and came across what some people consider to be the earliest precursors of print, and they were things like tokens that were in the digs. But what was interesting, as she began to realize there was a pattern to these tokens, that, and she also found that sometimes these tokens were in things almost like clay envelopes. And she basically sort of uncovered that the tokens were what she considered to be the earliest precursors of print. They were often used to actually formulate contracts and negotiations around, for example, livestock between people. But they enabled people to do mathematical computations and get a sort of a visual record of things in these negotiations. It's quite an important finding, because it basically sort of established very quickly how humankind were using symbolic representations, sometimes shells or whatnot, to represent their world in the context of thinking about or making a record or transacting things with others. That might not seem so profound, but in reality it also it was a precursor to some of the intense debates that occurred, particularly among Greek philosophers, but I'm sure across many cultures, when their oral tradition, in a sense, was being challenged by the advent of a print tradition. I remember in the Greek debates how people were lamenting the loss of the oral tradition as print was ascending in use. And so one actually sort of finds that when one thinks about literacy and its heritage, that it really actually got interwoven with people's lives in terms of economic transaction, memorializing things, whether sometimes with the visual arts. But also in intense intellectual discussions, where both face-to-face and eventually across space and time, not necessarily in a fashion that was synchronized. And so you find that, again, print is interwoven with people's lives, but what I would consider to be philosophical, almost musings, deliberations, and also government and legal discussions. Most people have accepted an age-old saying, but they forget that it was connected with a very important legal move, and that is the pen is mightier than the sword. When in England they basically displaced people basically putting things on their boundaries of their property with actually written deeds, and how significant that was in the development, for example, of property ownership and so on in the UK and elsewhere. and how writing actually became used as sort of a measure of the educated person, which included oftentimes the right to vote, and how education and the right to read was sometimes withheld from people as a way of ensuring that they wouldn't be entitled to participation in government or community affairs and so on. So it has a very interesting history that cuts across lives, cuts across philosophical musing, government, and legal development. And if you look at it historically, certainly in the Chinese world, where we saw the first advent of what I would consider to be the concept of universal literacy by mass printing of material, by the printing press, and then later by Gutenberg's press in Europe, it also became a focus of people sort of trying to understand the inherent meaning of text. If you lived in China across the centuries, you would have experienced that relative to the expectations of actually interrogating Confucius analytics for purposes of trying to uncover what the subtext was, what the meanings were represented by these ideas. So historically, the sort of research in literacy had very much a sort of an interesting anthropological as well as philosophical as well as legal sort of anchors. It emerged as a discipline more or less in conjunction with philosophy, but in its modern rendition, which I'll be getting into extensively in the first lecture, that didn't really occur until we saw the emergence of what some people call as Germanic or German idealism, which was the growth of positive views of science that emerged in Germany with the advent of the universities in Germany. In the following Galileo and following the Reformation in the 17 and 1800s. And so where science, and particularly a science related to reading, was very much informed by the advent of psychology and the attempt to link psychology with the study of science in very positivistic, very behavioral, very observable, measurable types of fashion. So as we move into the first lecture, you'll find that I sort of shift in a sense over to the psychological history of the field and haven't really spent any time sort of looking at it, literacy, as much as I probably should have, through a philosophical lens, through a legal lens, or through a literary lens. But indeed, I think that more closely represents what happened as a result of universities sort of leaning towards this German idealism, particularly as the discipline started to develop in the universities. So I thought I'd provide a little bit of that background and maybe encourage you to look at those areas for yourself. I think the history of the sociology of knowledge over time is very much connected to these and is a fascinating area to delve into, particularly across different countries, whether it be looking at the sociology or the history of sociology of knowledge in China, in Europe, in Africa, or in other locations. Thank you.